Hello again. So the next chapter is going to be called Setting Goals and the Importance of Doing Good. And we'll get into a lot of heavy political talk sooner rather than later, even some religion and philosophy, business, liberal, conservative, socialist, the Constitution. We're going to get all of that. All right, setting goals and the importance of doing good. The author will discuss thoroughly in the later sections on philosophy what the definition of good is and the various aspects of good, but as a precursor, some basic information will do the reader justice. Setting goals is also an indispensable task for the politician and goes hand in hand with performing the art of chasing what is good and right. Thus far, the author has mentioned throughout these pages that pursuing good is the ultimate goal of the politician, and the text will dive deep into the author's opinion of doing good sooner rather than later. However, all people on this planet can agree in some respect on the general attributes attributed to doing good. Where does one even begin then? Good is an interpretation based on both nature and nurture, as well as a subjective opinion and objective reality. So a politician trying to pursue good will base their interest on what they have experienced, their inherited notion of right from wrong based on their conscious mind or soul-driven instincts they were born with, their position in space and time, meaning their environment, and their general opinion. All politicians seem to chase their notion or fantasy of what is good and proper, including even the most evil of people in history, such as the likes of Adolf Hitler or Genghis Khan. Both of these demon-like rulers slaughtered millions of people in order to bring prosperity to them and their people. Obviously, this in no way justifies their actions, and the Holocaust is objectively wrong. Killing anyone is objectively wrong, and the leadership of Hitler and Genghis Khan are likely the most evil experiences ever in all the history of humanity, on such a large scale that their evil deeds have reverberated to the modern day. But, case in point, there's a subjective aspect to what a politician thinks is good or right, however mentally deranged that might be. Good, then, from most people's point of view, revolves around things such as compassion, empathy, righteousness, health, prosperity, or any positive notions that can be derived from reality as experienced by humanity. Many may argue that it is not possible to have consensus among humans, though, about what good is, but it should be the endeavor of every politician, especially a philosopher politician, to entertain and meditate on trying to solve the mystery. There are, of course, guides, such as religious texts and scriptures, societal definitions of good, and our simple ability to navigate right from wrong that cause either a clear conscience or a guilty one. Further, politicians and all those who feel inclined to dabble in righteousness or virtuousness can decipher their own thought processes in order to steer them to making good choices and take inventory periodically to reflect on past behavior. In philosophy, the term metaphysical is a word that, in a way, describes itself and means something combining the studies of philosophy with physics. But in a general sense, it is the physics of things that do not exist. It is the way things work in the intangible. For example, the metaphysical aspects of, say, a globe are all the descriptions of a globe, including being spherical, observable, to scale, colorful, and logical. But really, it is just a map of the Earth painted on a round piece of paper. The reason it is important to understand metaphysics is to incorporate the meanings of objects, and as previously stated, the author will deepen these thoughts in later chapters. But it is the goal of the politician to find the metaphysical meaning of what is good, and to be open to allowing thoughts about what is good and right to expand, contrast, and rest in the mind while they contemplate rational and logical thinking. This means that deciding whether to support a grant of money to a new school may seem like the right thing to do and a rational and logical decision, especially if education is lacking in the relevant jurisdiction where the school is to be built, and all can agree that building a school is a good thing. But this is a school that is going to give children education, experiences, community, and a better life, and that is why it is good. A school is not good because it is inherently good, it is good because of all the aspects that describe the form of school. Describing things in terms of forms is the basis of philosophy, and a whole tangent can be written about such, but you as the reader are well aware of the message at hand. It is important to get to the root form or base object of the issue at hand to make good decisions. All of this means that keeping an open mind in politics and accepting the way facts truly are is the difference between a mediocre politician and a great one. However, a problem arises because not only is it impossible not to have an opinion or bias, but it is also not good or correct for a politician to not have bias. In the political sphere or landscape, It is critical for the politician to have opinions and have bias and act accordingly. And it is the pursuit of ideals and values that align with this bias that is the reasoning for following or supporting a politician. And therefore, we should understand and appreciate the explanations of a politician's opinions. Next chapter is going to be called American Political Culture and the Two-Party System. Again, the book's not finished. This is just what I have so far. There are two major political parties within the United States, and both can stand for some criticism. Keep in mind that the author is a proud Democrat. However, although the following is about the United States of America, many people around the world are inquisitive about the American political landscape. So, switching gears from general politics, here is a focused criticism of the two major political parties in the United States. It is interesting to note that the political parties in the United States are largely split equally, and the power of the United States typically sways between the two parties, back and forth and over periods of time. This is because it is easier to criticize than to support a political party, and even harder to maintain positive approval ratings. Another interesting point to note is that with a two-party system in a democracy, the opposing party will take a stance opposite the other in order to secure votes, meaning if one is for an issue, the other will argue against it to secure the rest of the voters. Not taking a stance on most issues means a lack of support from those who feel passionately. It is difficult for many Americans to choose between one political party and another, but for most it is easy, leading to the author's criticism. The author is critical because if there are 10 issues down the board, how can someone align their views on all 10 issues perfectly in sync with all other members of the political party? Reality looks more like feeling this way or that on each issue, but the minds of the masses are swayed by the propaganda from the dominant political parties. Please, as the reader, remember to be open-minded and continue reading as these are opinions presented by word, a far stretch of the true feelings of the author as they are in his mind. Okay, so the Democratic Party is a party filled with absurdity as it stands today. They are an embarrassment to what it means to be a Democrat and do not represent the people who elect them in the manner that those who elect them intend. They commonly blindly follow the lobbyists whom they vow to contend, they blindly follow their party, and they do not differ from the beliefs held by those they regularly associate with across the aisle. Their obsession with the political party lines has led them to objectify Republicans in a way that makes the latter seem unhuman. They often do not show any interest in listening to Republicans, and will dismiss any varying viewpoint immediately. On the bright side, they are strict on the environment, providing government oversight, supporting welfare programs, improving Social Security, exploring progressive ideologies, and overall providing a professionalism that is consistent and can be trusted. A major concern felt by a majority of the American people is that liberal and progressive ideologies that are typically associated with the Democratic Party will take away from traditions and active, healthy living that have been beloved by families for years. There are also severe concerns that passing large budgets for infrastructure projects and green energy initiatives will not be worthwhile and will put unneeded burdens on the American public. Religious institutions, specifically American Protestant churches, have been in decline, but there's an obvious bias against the Democratic Party taking place by a worrying number of religious adherents and spiritual leaders in many parts of the country, and an even stronger bias against religion presented by members of the Democratic Party. There is a lack of identity and a lack of national pride that can be seen by some or many Democrats. The Democratic Party does not have the motivation to win elections because they do not have enough pride in their country. They believe the stories and false realities of the other nations in an attempt to justify their complaints. They have a harsh criticism of the United States and a misplaced admiration for other countries. There is no place better than the United States of America, and the fact that a single Democrat could argue otherwise makes them unfit to lead. Now, this is a matter of current affairs, as this book is being written a quarter century past the turn of the millennium, and Donald Trump is currently president of the United States for a second term. Hence, a criticism of the Republican Party would look something like the following. The obsession with Donald J. Trump needs to cease. It has gotten out of hand, and there is a ridiculousness in the atmosphere that can be felt from the depths of the core of the earth. Every other nation laughed from the day he became president in 2016 to the day he left office. The red hats and the delirium coming from Republicans were on a level unheard of. He left office in 2020, and the embarrassment emanating from the Republican Party continued for another 4 years, deep into another administration. The conspiracy theories and the fake news that Republicans ate up for years were of extreme concern. They were completely delirious to think that NBC, ABC, Associated Press, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and every single other news company in America was lying to them. They were completely wrong when they ever dared to say the news was fake. Their misunderstandings of all levels of social studies have run rampant to the point that they have blatantly deteriorated society. And the wildest part is that almost every Republican lied directly to the president in regard to almost every dynamic of the U.S. government, to the point there was a period of unfathomable confusion that is beyond comprehension. There was a blatant scramble for power based on falsehoods and lies from so-called conspiracy-ridden religious households that saw a multitude of morons elected. The only great news is that they were patriotic and lasted a single term, the second term being slightly more organized. There are plenty of legislators and department heads who have the mind to navigate politics and achieve goals that are held by their constituents, but the populist movement behind the current president caused a stir that has not been seen before in United States history. This populist movement has roots in the election before Donald Trump's first win and has seen a range of conservative thoughts and ideals let loose. Patriotism has become misconstrued with a sense of false masculinity and social bias that oppresses citizens who would otherwise hold conservative views and join the Republican Party. Their lack of support for globalization has pushed humanity in a negative direction. The conservative viewpoint of the Republican Party has turned the grand old party into a nationalist one. Regardless of their reasoning for isolationism, the current administration is dominated by the Republican Party, and they have depreciated global trade to downtrodden other countries and propelled the United States forward. And anti-immigration policies have had a negative humanitarian impact on millions of people. This lack of cooperation with the rest of the world is an unnecessary gamble that has caused worry and panic among all allies of the United States, foreign and domestic. The next topic is political theories, conservative, liberal, and socialist. That's the next chapter. I read a lot about it in the second part of this book. So, political philosophy is a conversation topic for many populations around the world, and definitions of conservative versus liberal thinking diverge based on one's environment. This means that conservative in a majority Muslim country will differ greatly from the meaning of conservative in a Western democracy. Conservatives are more concerned with the traditional aspects of society, where liberal is more concerned with a progressive standpoint, while socialists are more concerned with the revolution of the poor over the elite. Socialism is a philosophy that translates to society being equal. In the United States, society is not equal, and there is a large emphasis on freedom, including the freedom to become richer than one's peers, which is enjoyed by many and extends to all countries on the globe that participate in Western type of free democracy. However, in the United States, communities generally accept conservative thinking to be synonymous with the Republican Party and liberalism and socialism to persist throughout the Democratic Party. But that is not necessarily the case. Political philosophies drive the political parties, but they do not define them. For example, conservative Democrats can exist and liberal Republicans are present, but also stating that one has a conservative mentality on the economy and a liberal view of sociology is a valid conceptualization and viewpoint. Many will argue otherwise, but the author has already stated that politics is complicated and points of view are flexible and manipulable to cater to how an individual truly perceives or feels. Conservatism is a philosophy that has been present since before the founding of the United States, as well as liberalism, and these are drivers of political thought. Power and corruption is the next chapter, and these chapters aren't all finished, at all, by the way. Power always corrupts the politician, whether it is instantly or over a period of time. This has been the case since ancient periods, well before the birth of Christ, took place during the time of Christ, and continues to be a problem, or a fact, depending on how you view the modern-day leader. How the politician deals with this corruption and whether the corruption is revealed when the politician gains more power is of obvious concern. The modern politician must be ready to gain more power and status and be equipped with the coping mechanisms needed to not do anything rash or irresponsible. Many politicians, though, let their egos get the best of them, and they fall off the wagon quickly to make shady agreements that are to the detriment of those they lead. Artificial intelligence, which I mentioned I was using to help write this, I haven't taken any words or put into the artificial intelligence to write this and then put it in my own words or anything like that. Artificial intelligence, when prompted about power and corruption, listed 4 kinds of power in the form of institutional, personal, economic, and informational, an interesting notion for or way of dividing the kinds of power. The author will describe their own interpretation of these and reference corruption while doing so. Institutional power is the most obvious type of power. It is the one that an individual or politician acquires when they hold an official or executive position. Being able to, what I asked artificial intelligence was give me an outline of power, and it said there's 4 types of power, and then I wrote about those 4 types of power. It didn't tell me what to write at all. Institutional power is the most obvious type of power. It is the one that an individual or politician acquires when they hold an official or executive position. Being able to expel an individual from an organization is an example of institutional power. Setting the goals and objectives of the organization is another. And finally, a third example is staffing the organization and so on. Like all power, institutional power is likely heavily favored by the politician and their ultimate goal. Becoming an elected official or being appointed to a position of stature allows for the bidding of one's will to carry out justice and righteousness in a manner that the politician deems good. But as stated, it is important for the politician to be modest and humble, or they will not be able to further their political careers. There are many in charge who are overzealous and get themselves into trouble for overstepping boundaries, and there is truly legal recompense, justified or unjustified, for some politicians who are not careful. This is regardless of whether the individual tries to take an objective or subjective view of power. Many leaders, dictators, and aspiring congresspeople have believed that it is possible to take a pragmatic approach to politics without using morals to guide them, but ignoring morals is a recipe for disaster. That being said, pragmatism should be valued highly. The politician needs to remain calm and execute their responsibilities regardless of the level of power they hold. Institutional power is the basis of that ability to objectively carry out the role they play in government. Personal power comes in the form of charisma and social status, or the position the politician holds in friendly circles of influence. Being able to have friends who will back the politician, as they are likely to have such peers of influence, is key to success. The best politicians are popular and highly adored. This has been the case throughout history. And typically, there is a reason for this admiration. The admirable politician is always better than the feared. Any modern cultural reference will agree with this, and it is from the view of good versus evil that we can confirm a liked politician is better than a despised one. Economic power is the influence of financial resources. Typically, in most democracies, this does not stem from personal wealth, but from the budget of the organization that the politician is part of, and also campaign finances. Power is often controlled by those with money, and being able to persuade and coerce through the use of financial power is a devious but necessary pursuit. Many times in the United States, politicians at the highest level will use the withholding and giving of grants of money to sway local governments to pursue policies that align with national objectives. And one of the worst ways the churning of the wheels of democracy is caused to move by interest groups and lobbying efforts. Many businesses and individuals pay professionals and others to promote interests that align with either making a profit, protecting the environment, or building new infrastructure, depending on the goals of those in charge. Unions use lobby efforts, for example, and all of this is done in an effort to maximize the worth of the dollar and swaying the minds of the masses, or worse, the minds of those in charge. This relates back to the cautious approach needed when dealing with backdoor agreements and financial persuasion, as the politician can easily detract from constituents by a simple string of thoughts that would go something as follows. The politician believes they are best suited for the official position. They need campaign financing to make sure their idea of good is furthered. The politician takes money from interest groups and agrees to achieve the interest group's policy goals. The constituents are upset, and the politician is put out of power. Careful introspection and humility must be undertaken in order to mindfully navigate the flows of power in the modern-day political arena. Even on local and citywide levels, there needs to be a strong adherence to moral values that protect from pragmatic approaches to governing. Careful consideration must be given to decision-making when the ebbs and flows of power are being corrupted by charismatic and financial powers that influence politicians and institutional positions. Finally, the fourth form of power listed, although there are certainly more forms of power, is informational power and propaganda. This has become more and more relevant as communication avenues are expanded through the improvement of technology. The author has mentioned previously that violence and indecent acts are perpetuated through the sharing of media, and this has become a detriment to society. This is similar to the misinformation and small-time bickering that takes place over the internet by politicians. Misinformation, especially through the mass dissemination of it with tools such as artificial intelligence, is a horrifying notion in the modern world, and many individuals do not possess the technical know-how to differentiate truth from false reality around the globe. Even the most technologically literate people and social media specialists are baffled by some of the propaganda and concepts that are put out by various entities, all culminating in a world of media that is false, misguiding, and sometimes completely illegal. Corruption comes in many forms, and likely it takes place and develops over time. Not always are the highest levels of politics corrupt, as these are the politicians under the highest level of spotlight, but corruption runs deep and seeps through all levels of politics regardless. Corruption is further ingrained in the politician the more they get away with abusive behavior, and often corruption is disguised by some form of shadiness other than outright bribery. Many foreign nations experience bribery as an everyday form of politics, but this is unjust and against any moral code whatsoever. Even in nations where bribery is rampant, there is an understood notion that it is inherently wrong. Morally, this is often done in the ultimate pursuit of the common good and doing what's right, but the further one goes down the line of institutional power, down to the lowest forms of government and public officials, the more it seems to be done in the self-interest of the benefactor rather than for the good of the community. The more this bribery takes place, the more systematic it becomes, and more normalized the practices of corruption become. Loopholes and structures for procedures in legislatures and administrative functions are a common way to get policy passed and funded in the United States. Another is using the courts as a weaponized or defensive toolkit to avoid government oversight and defy orders from other entities, whether it be the states defying the federal government or a business being held up in court to prolong an issue. An example of a loophole in administrative functions being upheld in the court of law is the enactment of statewide bans on abortion being prevented by an injunction by lawyers and prolonged continuances and stays of actions to keep the ban from going into effect. This is, in fact, a form of corrupt policy making, regardless of whether the purpose is good or wrong. And even further, this corrupt policy practice is in a gray area of whether it is good or wrong, or just a fact of the matter of how politics is performed and plays out in the modern era. Another area of horrific use of the court system is the weaponization of it to prosecute former officials and censor them in the guise of charging crimes that may or may not have been committed, but are irrelevant and would not normally be charged. For example, charging politicians based on their accidental sharing of classified information, which is difficult not to do depending not on whether the prosecution deems it wrong or even a crime, but simply because they want the defendant put in jail so they are censored and not a detriment to the new officials or administration who replaces them. Oftentimes, corruption is based on subjective opinion and moral irresponsibility, with many politicians knowing what they are doing is wrong based on their conscious and subconscious notifying them of wrongdoing. This means they will have regret and a nagging notion of disobeying their values. This, when compounded through repeated action, then becomes the norm, and they are left with the inability to distinguish right from wrong when it comes to corrupt practices. The most important defense against corruption comes from accountability and whistleblowers. Many protections for such are given through legal codes, and checks and balances are put into place to make sure politicians are held to higher standards. It is important for constituents or the general public to make sure that leaders are held to this accountable and high standard. It so happens that many politicians do not remain in power long if partaking in unsavory and immoral ethics, and through the internet and mass communication, leaders are being held accountable more than ever. With the use of information sharing, it is very difficult to hide facts, and when a politician does something objectively wrong, it almost always surfaces in some form of the news or other outlet. Charging politicians with crimes when they are making decisions for the good of the masses becomes an ethical challenge, and this scenario extends far and wide, for it is difficult to hold leaders accountable when they are truly doing what they believe to be in the best interest of the public. The question arises whether leeway should be given in such cases when the political elites are serving justice in forms contrary to what others may see as good, but they believe to be right. It would seem recently that social media influence has gone to the brains of the modern politician to form a cocky mentality when they show reckless abandon for making policy decisions based on clout and reverence rather than research and instinctual knowledge of what is correct. It is also interesting to note that much of the criticism thrown against the different sides of the political debate is a mirror going in each direction. For example, many Republicans consider corruption to be rampant in the Democratic Party, whilst Democrats say the same in the other direction, arguing Republicans are nothing but corrupt pawns. Okay, so this next chapter is called American History and the Balancing of Past, Future, and Present. It's basically my interpretation of history in the United States. Okay. The history of the United States can be divided into 4 time periods of advancement for the purposes of analyzing the culture of the United States. This begins with pre-founding ideologies leading up to the end of the Civil War in 1865. From the end of the Civil War to the end of World War II in 1945, that end to the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the Internet Revolution in 2001, and then finally with the witnessing of substantive digital computing from 2001 to the modern day. The United States is an interesting nation as it is unique, influential, and in a position in time of the world to potentially be the greatest in any undertaking that is rationally possible. It has excelled in many different areas through experience and dedication by its citizens and is willing to lead the world in technological progression. The United States has been the moral compass that guides the world throughout the 20th and 21st centuries and will continue to do so for many tens of years. This nation is a world peacekeeping force and one of the only bastions of understanding and consciousness that pointedly opposes the conquering and devastation pursued by most dictators and despots, as well as the nations that follow such. The ability to keep the peace leads to an observable continuation and amplification of future and previous history. The culture of the United States, which many argue is lacking since they are so commonly exposed to it, is instead lacking in admiration for what is a cultural highlight of the world. The culture of the United States was largely created before the country was born, based upon the common law, functions of government, language, and literature, and similar personalities inherited from their heritage, the British Empire. Following and working simultaneously to instill a deep work ethic revolving around trade and self-preservation came a religious, God-encapsulating culture from the various Protestant churches. The culture of the United States was then ruptured, following a culture that was being built on the backs of slaves. Slavery flourished and was legally protected as a means for Americans to allow more nefarious tendencies to be set loose. The culture was quickly divided into a sophisticated group of thinkers who believed in theories of equality, justice, and liberty, and then with self-absorbed, privileged males with a culture of worship to their own subcategory of being that confused their own inability to rationalize with the guise of being farmers and believing in states' rights to prevent tyrannical rule. The later, privileged white males would modernize into becoming racist rednecks, and those who fought against the institution of slavery and for the treatment of black people as equals as disillusioned Yankees. Not because they treated black people as equals, but because they became disillusioned Yankees and that they were still racist and rapist probably, and still believed in segregation. So anyway, from a constitutional and legal standpoint up until the Civil War, which was the rupture between pro-slavery and anti-slavery, there was the formulation and beginnings of the nation. Unfortunately, since slavery was legal and the driving cultural norm of the United States, one cannot analyze the formulation and beginnings of the nation without taking it into account. That being said, black people were condemned to slavery, and white privileged males were largely the driving factor in the creation of the framework of the United States. Politicians did not create the culture of the United States, rather they manipulated, condemned, or damaged culture typically. Therefore, it can be stated that the masses, including slaves and voters even more, created the culture of the United States as well, from colonial England to the founding of the United States to the Civil War, which then split the nation. It should be noted that by the time the Civil War happened, both the Republican and Democratic parties were established, with racists on both sides and cultural differences that spread evenly across different factions of both political parties and varied by states and affiliations. It should also be noted that the time leading up to the Civil War is also the time that the Republican Party and Democratic Party evolved into actual political entities, following approximately 70 years of initial evolution and normal political breaking and coming together. Following this, there was a period of great technological and spiritual advancement, many industrial inventions, and population growth due to Christians and immigrants. The creation of the modern industrial powerhouse that dominated after World War II was at hand. But to get to that point, many other wars were fought, the territory of the United States doubled, and the population worked hard to build infrastructure, institutions, and resource gathering and trading in all areas of economic relevance. Also, it should be admired that for the 30 years following the Civil War, Reconstruction legislation was passed, and the rebuilding of society and the deinstitutionalization of slavery were the primary legal recompense at the time. This took us through the pre-modernization of the United States. Now, it should not be underestimated how much technology had rapidly evolved in the first time period examined. From pre-founding to the Civil War, as well as the time period leading up to the end of World War II, it is a common misconception that the Civil War was similar to the Revolutionary War in creating the United States. But this is not the case, and it shows the importance of observable technological advancement. An example being 10,000 men strong armies with iron ships and Gatling guns at the end of the Civil War in 1865, compared to the 100-man strong armies with 50 muskets common around 1776. The modernization of the United States largely began at the turn of the century, which followed the Civil War and Reconstruction after slavery, and began with the expanded use of electricity around 1900. Electricity is the. Before I get into the modernization of the United States, I want to say I'm very pro civil rights. That's one of the main reasons I'm a Democrat. That's Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. What I was saying before about slavery, the South, racist, rednecks fighting for slavery, the North, disillusioned Yankees that still thought black people were inferior. I could write tangents about civil rights, but we'll get to that later. So, continue to hear me out, please. The modernization of the United States largely began at the turn of the century, which followed the Civil War and Reconstruction after slavery, and began with the expanded use of electricity around 1900. Electricity is the driving technology that created the digital age as we see today and had extremely rapid changing effects on the cultural and social landscape of everyday life, pre-World Wars. Electricity allowed for lights to be on inside, allowed for transfer of communications, refrigeration, industrial experimentation and building, expanded printing, and so much more, and truly modernized society into one where any individual of today could live comfortably if put back in time. The time period from the end of the Civil War, 1865, to the end of World War II, 1945, saw the occupation of modern territory and significant advancements in war, culture, and science that led to a global force and nation that could fight a world war and win. However, the United States did not so much achieve victory in World War II itself, as it had lower casualty numbers than many other nations and lacked the domestic fighting depth that many European and Asian nations experienced. Instead, it achieved victory through diplomatic means in the end of what was the largest war in history. This is not to take away from the fighting that the United States did, as they are in fact the saviors of the world, as the Axis forces would have likely triumphed without the involvement of the United States, but it is to say that victory conditions, that's what I am talking about, were disproportionate to the fighting that actually took place. The United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful country in the world and has held on to that title since. After World War II, democracy flourished and manufacturing thrived, and the United States was able to solidify its gains from the end of World War II by equally sharing in the wins of the war with the Soviet Union. Since the Soviet Union was near equal to the United States and the only other clear recipient of the spoils of war, and being the epitome of communism, a battle for ideologies ensued on a global scale. In foreign affairs, the United States' main objective was simply to ensure that democracy in government was more prevalent than any form of communism, as it was both the right moral course of action and a realistic path to form friendly relations and allies. This heavy emphasis on democracy was propelled by the founding mindset of freedom and liberty as the most important ideological pursuits and was in line with already standing Protestant ideals and still continuing pursuit of equality based on gender, race, and sexual orientation. Technology was also still advancing rapidly due to electricity, computers, and large modeling and business procedures became mainstream and were utilized by both private and public entities. All of this led to a division of corporate America with manufacturing America, a division between rich and poor, which also took place in every other nation. Wealth disparities increased, but in the United States, through its favoring of freedom and democracy, the country avoided the communist propaganda and confusion revolving around wealth disparity that encapsulated so many people-centric and labor organizations. Of course, wealth disparity kind of began more around the turn of the century, World War I. But anyway, it's a big deal in communist countries. Eventually, the Soviet Union was dismantled around 1991, and communism was found in a minority of nations. In Western civilizations, the freedom and acceptance became predominant. These predominant nations led the world in technological innovation specifically, which also heavily drove American culture and ideals into basically every corner of the world. If not adopted as the norm, Western or American culture was pursued by the opposition in any political arena, and vice versa. Finally, we arrive at the final time period, which is based on the internet revolution really picking up momentum and driving all facets of modern society from 2001 to today. Everything has become so complex, and there's a bit of a standstill as it comes to geopolitical evolutions. Most events are secluded and isolated to smaller nations, and there are not many political hotspots that have direct political impacts on large swaths of land or enormous amounts of people, as was the case at all times prior. The internet, however, has created minus Ukraine and Israel, and obviously Iran at the moment. The internet, however, has created globalization, data processing, global navigation, social media, supply chains, and so much more, and continues to increase every facet of research and development. Most importantly, all of these technological advancements are the driving forces that influence culture. The globalizing of data processing to help streamline supply chains using cost-effective shipping to deliver products bought through social media is just one example, utilizing a list of fundamental progressions of the modern era. Artificial intelligence, cloud storage, and quantum computing are all things revolving around the internet era that will become more understood and used as this time period continues. The modern era is marked by technology and culture that emanates from the United States as the dominant influential force on the planet. Now the next chapter will be understanding of not understanding of politics. I have not written anything for that chapter yet. And then following that, the greatest happiness principle. Give me a second, I'm going to drink some water. Okay, so the greatest happiness principle, and we're back to philosophy and the politician. Before diving into this section on finding happiness, the author would like to note that the philosophical quandary of finding a principle that provides the largest amount of happiness is difficult, and the musings that follow are not easily understood. The general idea is that intellectual pursuits, mental and emotional intelligence, and a pursuit toward what is good, right, and just provide the most amount of utility or happiness to the individual. When put together in a collective, the greatest amount of happiness comes from a righteous and just society. All politicians should be seeking to find a principle that explains the motives for individuals and collective actions, but also should be concerned with finding a compass to discern what should be sought as it relates to finding the true definition of what is good. The greatest happiness principle pertains to both the author and the reader as an example of philosophy in pursuit of finding a compass toward what is good in a world so far described as bleak and convoluted. The greatest happiness principle is seeking the greatest happiness in the least amount of pain, and how actions are based on pleasure versus pain. Note that this whole section relates to seeking what is good and philosophy being a general ambiance of the whole narrative of this manifesto. And not only is it important for the politician to understand their own motives, but also understand the motives and wants of constituents or people whom they govern. Simply put, seeking to define right and wrong begins with utilitarianism and finding the greatest amount of utility, pleasure, absent pain, for the individual and the masses. This is the foundational question for all of philosophy and seeks to find a moral compass for navigating thought patterns and actions, as stated. This is an alternative to sophist or skeptical thinking and is based on scientific pursuits by being in direct objection or coordination to and with determining scientifically a paradox. What causes the brain to enjoy certain things and dislike others. There is an enigma in the study of science in that it seeks to prove itself wrong, the paradox. Science is at issue because the evidence to prove what is enjoyable has murky founding principles. The final understandings of the founding principles of each subject of science are essentially the results of combinations of social constructs morphing into forms, morphing into changes of matter, reality, and thought. Typically, in science, the conclusion comes before the examination. But in the liberal arts, many times the process of creation is more essential than the final product. This is true for moral definitions and legislative action. The test of right from wrong comes when the creation or examination process is at its peak, and therefore not learned after a so-called conclusion. All actions are purposefully seeking a final result, meaning right from wrong actions are in the pursuit of a conclusion, not as a result. There is in this revelation the never irrelevant nature of being that informs humanity of instinctive decision-making, the ability to choose right from wrong, inherited at birth. Most suggest it is given by God, but many philosophers are obliged to think that this instinct is muddied when assessing the moral inclinations of action-based dynamic decision-making. These philosophers would argue that there is simply a gray area of unguided moral judgment when individuals are applying themselves over a time to a situation. In ethical thinking, these acknowledgments provide a necessity for general laws, perhaps the reasoning for the ideals behind utilitarianism and the greatest happiness principle. The compass of morality is swayed in each instance based upon the concrete moral framework that influences that particular instance. Philosophers understand that these concrete moral codes that are in existence, regardless of their source, are from an ethereal entity or intangible system of truths, not to be taken with disregard. However, much of moral study is proven in the facts themselves. For example, imparting kindness is morally right based on the action inherent in providing kindness. The other way to look at right and wrong, and truth and untruthfulness, is that they derive their meaning from the connection of the senses transmitting experiences to the mind. This holds that concrete principles of morality must exist to guide decisions, but it dismantles the abstract idea of proving a moral fact in the act itself. From this, it can be concluded that regardless, all philosophy is seeking to find the root of all morality, whether preceding the results of an instance or after, and thence in the action itself or as described by outside perception. This argues that everything requires general laws to be organized, and there must be one singular, unbreakable concept that holds for deciding between the various principles when they conflict. As the great utilitarian John Stuart Mill wrote, and thus, as a result of combining all schools of thought, ought to be self-evident. As a result of lacking such an ideal, the effect should require study of the effects of having or not having one formal standard for discerning morality. Since there is a pattern in the morality of humanity, it can be assumed that there is some form of a golden standard to be applied, the greatest happiness principle. The absence of foundational knowledge and philosophical studies of humanity has caused ethical guidance to be a faculty of humanity's general perception. This general perception translates to general happiness, which is a measure of humanity's morality and a measure of utility, determined by the greatest happiness principle. The greatest happiness principle, of course, is the method for providing the largest amount of net happiness. All schools of thought admit that individuals are guided by their seeking happiness, but utilitarians become frustrated that no other philosophy allows seeking happiness to be the defining moral principle of humanity. Many state the moral principle of humanity to be the rule that someone acts on being a universal fact for rational beings. They argue that egregious behavior is awarded unsought consequences and therefore is not pursued, but according to utilitarianism, this does not take into account unreasonable circumstances, such as those where an individual undertakes behavior with zero regard for punishment. Utilitarianism explains that one cannot prove the greatest happiness principle based on traditional definitions of proof, because what is proven to be good requires prior proof of being good, which cannot exist before initially being proven good. If arguing that there is an equation for establishing what is good, then it can only work as long as good comes from the means of pursuing good, and not simply the end product of doing good. This is not a way of strictly proving something, but can be related to solving the riddle of whether or not something is good, and by being considered good is proven to be true. Humanity is not leveled to a state where accepting the proof of something as good is necessary to be aware of the implications. The substance of the act and the end to be considered as good or not cannot be rationalized by scientific processes of the mind, and therefore the only equivalent of proof to be derived is that holding of something as good persists across opinions. The nature of this revelation, when science is applied, is broken down into the case itself and the grounds on which the formula of pleasure versus pain is applicable. But it is the initial and instinctive determination of whether something is good or not that the greatest happiness principle should be used, which helps dig to the roots of moral thinking. If the greatest happiness principle is understood as an explanation for instinctive preconceptions, then any argument against it is mute. Before beginning to elaborate on why the utilitarian standard of pursuing the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people is a foundational moral thinking that allows individuals and, therefore, humanity to pursue and receive good, defining what pleasure is must be done. Then, having illustrated the doctrine, enlightenment on the subject is provided by explaining how moral inclination and the pursuit of what is good philosophically relate to the happiness derived from that pleasure. Adherence to previous precepts of utilitarianism simplify it to utility versus pain and a strict sense of determining right from wrong. Some would propose that the theory is bland when contrasting the words pleasure and utility too much. These utilitarians do injustice in the creators of in that the creators of utilitarianism did not make a distinction between utility and pleasure. Opponents often fail to observe utility in some of its presentations, and utility is not only misused in negative connotations, but also in the affirmative, as if it were a higher state than mere pleasure. The population is gathering its definition of utility from these precepts, and the word utility is being used as a measure of something other than purely pleasure versus pain. Utility, being equal to the greatest happiness principle, maintains actions to be right or wrong proportionate to how much happiness or the reverse is created. Further, there is a more compass established by the theory, and it revolves around pain and pleasure and the ideas and questions and to what extent they apply. These nuances do not affect the final consequence of life that the theory proposes, the theory being that freedom from pain is the only sought end, and that all things of pleasure are sought for the results of that pleasure or to the general preferment of pleasure over pain. Many initially, when hearing explanations of utilitarianism, will be disheartened to hear the diminishing of life to merely a choice between pleasure and pain. Thus, many philosophers around the world criticize harshly the moral theorization brought by the ideas of utility. Many objectors of utilitarianism suggest that man would be no different than animals in nature if brought to the bare level of always seeking pleasure. The fix for this thinking is the realization that life being good for one individual must be good for another is false. This comparison is degrading because regardless of why, the fact remains that humans have an observable higher purpose that distinguishes them from both animals and other individuals. Whether right or wrong is based on or related to pleasure and pain, it does not interfere with this fact and may exist alongside any other theories defining morals and life. Humans must have a cognitive appreciation of happiness, whereas other animals do not possess such abilities. Epicureanism, similar to utilitarianism, is often cited as a primary opposing theory to utilitarianism, as it holds that moderation of pleasure over pain is a defining principle for creating a moral code. But this diminishes the realities of happiness to merely positive sensations. Many philosophers have concluded that the pleasures of the mind were superior to those of the body. However, this is due to situational benefits rather than the happiness created. Admittedly, some forms of pleasure may be more desirable and create more happiness than others, and that quality is considered as much as quantity is when measuring utility or the amount of happiness or the greatest amount that can be ascertained. To distinguish qualities of pleasure, there is only one way, which is to find which of the two pleasures, through the experiences of others, affirms the fact that it is more pleasurable. Following on from distinguishing between two options of pleasure, it can be seen that if one of the two is preferred by those who have experienced it, regardless of the pains associated with the options, then the quality is therefore determined as superior. It is a substantiated principle that individuals give preference to the experiences that employ the highest states of being for that individual. It does not matter that an animal is more content than a human would still not degrade themselves to the lower faculties of simpler creatures. A human will not trade with another human either for overall intelligence and emotional intelligence, as the overall satisfaction from the overall desires of the more intelligent individual is greater than those of the less bright. A rejection of this idea comes when extreme unhappiness is experienced. Then an individual will, in that moment, likely trade places with another of any faculty, regardless of whether it is greater or less. There could be many reasons for the unwillingness to degrade one's own faculties, such as pride or for freedom and independence, or even because of the faculties of power and excitement or for ability. But it is a sense of dignity that truly defines why intelligent beings prefer their existence over simpler minds, and how, because of the pleasure gained from the experiences of life in the absence of avoidable pains, intelligent beings experience more utility than others. Whoever argues that an intelligent being is not generally happier in equal circumstances than someone of inferior intelligence confuses the idea of happiness and contentment. It is a fact that someone who has a higher ability to improve their happiness due to a state of extreme unhappiness has the ability to receive more happiness, and those stated in happiness will find more to be imperfect and only find more utility in learning from those imperfections and be happier than those unable to identify the same imperfections. As John Stuart Mill said, it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. It is possible to argue that many supplant pleasure with lower faculties. This is only due to a reverence for the higher faculty. People often choose the second best option for increasing happiness, an example being the pursuit of bodily pleasures at the expense of health, though they understand that health is more important than temporary pleasure. Being noble is arguably the highest faculty of happiness, but the definition of nobility is questionable. Also, many people who are fully devoted to the youthful pursuits of being noble fall into selfishness and resentment as they get older. Those who go through such a change, however, do not choose this of their own volition, but are destined for such a course. This giving up of pursuits of nobility due to age is a result of the positions in society that individuals fill, which makes it not favorable to pursue the higher faculty, and as a result, the higher faculty provides less utility. To decide between two faculties of pleasure, the best course of action is to consult with individuals of knowledge of both options, and whichever they decide is the better course, or of which the majority agrees is the correct course of action. There should be less apprehension in choosing this option based on the quality of pleasure, since there is a lack of apprehension already regarding quantity once the faculty has been evaluated. Pain does not have to be directly contradicting pleasure, but pleasures always include the absence or alleviation of pain. A better understanding of utilitarianism is derived from understanding that, apart from the quantity of pleasure, the quality of pleasure is in the judgment of the chooser and is regarded as such. Of course, an individual's own happiness is not the determinant of the greatest happiness principle, but it is the collective greater happiness altogether that is the correct pursuit. Therefore, the sum of all pleasurable and undertaken choices must be greater than the lower sums of utility of the opportunity cost. Utilitarianism is only able to be a pursuit of nobility and righteousness because individuals are lifted by the nobility of those around them, and concerning happiness being derived from that nobility, it is worth it, as the happiness derived simply from nobility is superior to any other option. The ultimate goal of the greatest happiness principle is the absence of as much pain as possible, and the highest possible attainment of enjoyment from pleasure for all individuals and groups in a society through being noble. For any philosophers out there, I tried my best. And that is the most difficult part of the whole book, the most complicated part.